Welcome to the Wedge, and this is our Week 4 edition for the 2004 NFL season. And as always, we'll be giving our quick picks for every single game this weekend, plus fantasy fortunes, our fantasy picks, as well as a weekly rewind for Week 3, and upon further review for the Thursday night football game. But let's get things started off with the quick picks. Quick picks! Alright, let's get started with the Thursday night football game, and we got the New York Giants going into Washington to face the Redskins, and in that game I like the Redskins. Then moving on to the 1 o'clock games on Sunday, we have the Buffalo Bills at the Houston Texans. I like the Texans. Then the Green Bay Packers are going into Chicago to face the Bears. I like the Chicago Bears. Then we have the Detroit Lions at the New York Jets, and I like the Detroit Lions in that game. Then we have the Tennessee Titans at the Indianapolis Colts, and I'm taking the Indianapolis Colts to win that one. Then we have the Miami Dolphins at the Oakland Raiders, and I like the Miami Dolphins to win. Then we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers going into Pittsburgh to face the Steelers, and I'm going with the Steel Curtain, the Pittsburgh Steelers. Then we have the Carolina Panthers, the Baltimore Ravens. I'm taking the Ravens in that game. And then at 4 o'clock, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars, the San Diego Chargers, and I'm going with the Chargers in that one. We also have the Atlanta Falcons and the Minnesota Vikings. I'm taking the Falcons on the road. Then we have the Philadelphia Eagles at the San Francisco 49ers, and I'm taking the 49ers. That brings us to Sunday night, where we have the New Orleans Saints going into Dallas to face the Cowboys, and I'm taking Drew Brees and the Saints. Moving on to Monday Night Football, we got the New England Patriots at the Kansas City Chiefs, and I like the New England Patriots to win in prime time on Monday night. So those are my quick picks for Week 4. Quick picks! And now it's time for Fantasy Fortunes.
Fantasy Fortunes!
In this segment, we go over our fantasy picks for the week. At quarterback, I like Matt Ryan of the Falcons going into Minnesota to face the Vikings, as the Falcons should be able to put up some pretty big numbers there in Minnesota. I also like Phillip Rivers of the San Diego Chargers at home against the Jacksonville Jaguars, as the Jaguars have the worst defense in the NFL. They let up the most passing yards and most rushing yards. Even though the Chargers don't have Ryan Matthews, they should put up some big numbers through the air, and they actually should be relying heavily on that air attack. They don't really have too much of a ground game. So then on the ground, at running back, I like Fred Jackson of the Buffalo Bills going into Houston to face the Texans. As the Bills are a run-heavy team, and although they do split carries, Fred Jackson puts up some pretty good numbers, as he's a target coming out of the backfield to catch passes, and he gets yards on the ground as well. I also like DeMarco Murray of the Dallas Cowboys at home against the Saints, as DeMarco Murray has been putting up some pretty good numbers, as he's one of the league's top rushers, and going against that Saints defense that struggles on the road. Then at receiver, I like Eddie Royal of the San Diego Chargers going against Jacksonville for much of the same reasons that I like Phillip Rivers, and I think Eddie Royal should be one of his main targets, is that he seems to target Royal more than Floyd. And Royal, although doesn't necessarily get as many yards, he does get the touchdowns. He had 2 touchdowns last week. And against that weak passing defense of Jacksonville, he should have a big day. I also like Randall Cobb of the Green Bay Packers going against Chicago in Chicago. And Randall Cobb last year had a couple of touchdowns in Week 17 against the Bears as he came back from his injury. And so I expect him to have another big day against the Bears. The Bears have been looking pretty impressive, but the Packers are going to have to rely heavily on their passing game, and Aaron Rodgers is more than capable of getting some yards in that one and getting the ball to Cobb. So at tight end, I've got Jimmy Graham of the New Orleans Saints going into Dallas. I expect Graham to have a big game. He hasn't really put up too many numbers so far this season, but I think this will be his breakout week. The Cowboys' defense is not that strong. Plus, I expect the Saints to win this game, as they cannot lose a third game on the road for their third loss of the season in September. So I expect Jimmy Graham to have a big day there in Dallas. Moving on to kicker, I've got Dan Carpenter of the Buffalo Bills going into Houston to face the Texans. I think the Bills will be able to move the ball up and down the field, but I think they're going to struggle to get into the end zone, and that's where Dan Carpenter is going to come in to play, is he should get plenty of opportunities to kick some field goals. So I think he should put up some pretty good points. He's been pretty reliable, and he's been pretty solid for the Bills this season so far. So now, last but not least, the defense. And at defense, I'm going with the New England Patriots, and they're going into Kansas City to face the Chiefs. Of course, going into Kansas City is usually difficult, but Tennessee was able to go there and win. The Chiefs did pick up their first victory against the Dolphins last week, who had actually beaten the Patriots. But the Patriots defense, with the anchor of Vince Wilfork and the way he's playing, they're one of the top defenses in the league. Their secondary's playing really good. They're causing turnovers all around. They're just one of the top defenses. And really, if you see, who's playing, who's got a bye week, and who's matching up against who, I think this is probably the best matchup for defense, at least in my opinion, for whatever that's worth. Those are my fantasy fortune picks for Week 4.
Fantasy Fortunes.
And now it's time for the Weekly Rewind. And in the Weekly Rewind, we look at the week that was. And so the past week was Week 3, so we're going to look at our quick picks and our fantasy fortunes from Week 3 and see how we did, and just go over the week in general as it is. So going back to our quick picks from Week 3, we actually had the best week so far here. As in Week 1, we had just 9 and 7, and then 6 and 10 in Week 2. But then we bounced back and we flipped it around in 10 and 6 in Week 3. And going back to look it over, we picked the Falcons. They beat up on the Bucs on Thursday night. Then on Sunday, we got the Bills wrong. Picked the Bills over the Chargers, and the Chargers won that one. San Diego was very impressive going into Buffalo. We picked right on Cincinnati, as Cincinnati won at home, and they won decisively. They almost shut out the Titans in that game there. That was a very impressive game for Cincinnati, their offense and their defense, of course. Then there was Baltimore versus Cleveland. They picked wrong there. I picked Cleveland. They lost a heartbreaker just by 2 points to the Ravens after winning by 2 points the week earlier to the Saints. Then we got Dallas and St. Louis. Got that one right. Picked Dallas. They won on the road. That was a game that was closer than I thought it would be. Closer than anyone would thought it would be. Austin Davis threw 3 touchdowns. His first 3 touchdowns of his career. Then you got the Packers and the Lions. Picked the Lions and got that one right. That was all defense in that game, though. Let me tell you, I was not expecting it to be such a low-scoring affair necessarily, even though both teams got defense, but they also got some offense too. But the Packers so far this season have been struggling to score, as they average only 18 points per game. And that's a very low number, especially for an Aaron Rodgers quarterback team. So then we get the Colts and the Jaguars, and of course that was an easy pick right there. The Colts beat the Jaguars. Jaguars been struggling. Thought they'd be better, but they haven't really shown much to prove that. Looks like Blake Bortles might be starting to take over, as he did get in the game there. So we'll see what happens moving forward. They also had the Raiders and the Patriots, and picked the Patriots, got that one right. It's another defensive game. Seeing a lot more defense in a league that everybody, expected to just be high scoring. Everybody's talking about, it's a passing game now. But we're seeing that the old adage of defense wins championships, as we saw with the Seahawks back at the Super Bowl, and now we see teams with the onus being on defense here so far in 2014. But moving on, we had the Vikings and the Saints won, and we picked that one right. Then we had the Texans and the Giants, and we got that wrong. Picked the Texans to go into New York, but instead the Giants picked up their first win, and they handed the Texans their first loss of this young season, as we are still in the first month. And that was, really impressive running by the Giants for sure. Rashad Jennings tore it up in that game, almost had 200 yards, just 5 yards shy of that. We had the Redskins and the Eagles. Picked the Eagles in a game, got it right, but that was a lot closer than I would have expected. I mean, the Eagles are kind of known for playing close games, but it's really, unexpected and impressive to see the numbers Kirk Cousins is putting up with the Redskins. Of course, he did put up some impressive numbers last year as well, although it didn't translate into any victories, and it didn't translate into a victory in Week 3 either. So we had the Niners and the Cardinals. Picked the Cardinals, and that was a game that was all defense too. Even without Carson Palmer, Cardinals did it with Drew Stanton. Carson Palmer not expected to play again this week, but is saying that he should be ready for the week after that. So we'll keep you updated on that as we get more info. Then we had the Broncos and the Seahawks, and the Seahawks won the rematch of Super Bowl 48. Of course, it took overtime to do it. I picked the Seahawks in a game that was very close. And then the next three games got them all wrong. See, at that point, I was like, oh, it's looking good. I'm going to have such a good week. And I mean, 10-6, you know, that to me, I should always have at least 10-6. But friggin', was hoping to get like more, like, you know, 12 or something. But the Dolphins beat the Chiefs in Miami. So I actually picked the Dolphins, and the Chiefs beat the Dolphins. So, see, I'm still, like, shocked by it. I still can't believe it, right? But the Chiefs won in Miami. They picked up their first, you know, win of the season. Of course, they're going to be facing the Patriots this week coming up. And we had the Dolphins losing at home. And then that kind of caused some controversy about Ryan Tannehill and his starting position. Of course, Tannehill said, geez, you know, we're still in the mix of things, you know. Well, it's kind of early to be already calling for his job, but we'll see how he bounces back. Then we also at the Sunday night game, the Steelers and the Panthers. I picked the Panthers at home, but nope, the Steelers, they surprised me. I'm really surprised they won that game. The Steelers are starting to look more like the team that they were in the second half of 2013. Although at first, I mean, they just barely won that game, you know, against Cleveland. Then they lost to Baltimore, and then now they go on the road and beat Carolina. So it'll be interesting to see moving forward how good these Steelers are. The Panthers, you know, after the way they played in the first 2 weeks, thought they'd be able to beat the Steelers at home, but they pick up their first loss of the season. And then on Monday night, I almost, you know, even doing the upon further review, I was kind of like, why am I picking the Jets? Like, everything I'm saying kind of leads towards the Bears. And, you know, it really was a toss-up, is what I was saying. It could go either way. And really, the thing that I should have took into account was how good Jay Cutler is on Monday night. It's kind of a stat that's like, what does it really mean, you know? But, I mean, he's only lost one game on Monday night, and that trend of success on Monday night continued as the Bears pulled off the win in New York. So that was the quick picks for week 3, and we were 10-6 in those quick picks. So then we look over for the fantasy fortunes. You know, take a look at what we picked in fantasy fortunes for week 3. We had Drew Brees, Matthew Stafford. And Brees did okay. He put up decent numbers. Stafford was trash again. After putting up those big numbers in week 1, he's failed to put up numbers in week 2 and in week 3. That's part of why he's not in our fantasy fortune picks for week 4. Trent Richardson did not have the game I thought he would have, even though the Colts beat up on the Jags. He got some points, but not much. LaShawn McCoy continues to disappoint with fantasy numbers. He got next to nothing against the Redskins in a game that, you know, the two teams combined to score over 70 points. You know, so how is that? How do you freaking only get 2 freaking fantasy points when 70 points are scored on the scoreboard between the two teams? But of course, I would think he's gonna eventually start getting some numbers. But when, Shady, when? Then the receiver had Megatron, and you know, I mean, he got some numbers. At least he got something, but still nothing. Not what I expected. Half of what I expected. Of course, going against Green Bay there, you know, can't be too surprised. Still thought he put up better numbers than he did. Mike Wallace put up almost the exact same numbers as Johnson, which is, you know, I mean, for Mike Wallace, that's decent, but still expected better numbers out of him. The one place where I really actually did right was Greg Olsen at tight end. And although he didn't get a lot of points, he actually had the best day of any tight end on Sunday, or in week 3, with his Sunday night game there. So that was one that I actually couldn't have did better on. So that was the one good pick. And then Matt Bryant, he did all right. Not the best, but he did okay. He got some points. And then the Bengals, they did pretty good on defense. I would have hoped they would have got more. Of course, they almost got that shutout, but still they did pretty decent as they dominated the Titans. Now let's look actually at who was the best picks in the fantasy fortune that we didn't pick. And the picks to pick for quarterback, the top 3 fantasy performances in week 3. This is a new thing we're doing now. We're going to tell you the top performers in fantasy and in stats as part of our weekly rerun. So let's check out the top fantasy performers for week 3 at quarterback. It was Andrew Luck. He had 370 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, 15 rushing yards, and that was 31 fantasy points. Kirk Cousins for the Redskins in the loss, he was the second performer at quarterback with 427 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. He did have that interception, and he had 5 rushing yards, and that gave him 27 fantasy points. Then the third top quarterback for week 3 was Nick Foles with 325 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 12 rushing yards for 26 fantasy points. So that Eagles-Redskins game was the way to go for a quarterback in the fantasy for week 3. At running back for fantasy in week 3, the top performer was Marshawn Lynch. He had 88 rushing yards, 1 touchdown, and 40 receiving yards, as well as a receiving touchdown. He had 24 points and just a great performance by Beast Mode. He got the touchdown that put them ahead in overtime to give them the victory. Then number 2 at running back for fantasy in week 3, we had Rashad Jennings as he came out with impressive numbers. Actually, he had 176 rushing yards. I know earlier I said he was 5 shy. I thought he was 5 shy, but I guess I was wrong. So he was 24 yards shy of 200. And he had 1 touchdown for 23 fantasy points. And then Joe McKnight of the Kansas City Chiefs. He only had 3 rushing yards, but he had 64 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns, and that gave him 18 fantasy points. So that's a rarity when the number 3 fantasy leader at running back only had 3 rushing yards. But those 2 touchdowns that he caught, along with the 64 receiving yards, make him the 3rd best. At receiver, for fantasy points in week 3, the top receiver was Julio Jones with 161 yards and 2 touchdowns, which gave him 28 fantasy points. As the Falcons just ran up the score on Tampa Bay there on Thursday night. Then we had number 2 is Jeremy Maclin of the Philadelphia Eagles against the Redskins. He had 154 yards and 1 touchdown to give him 21 fantasy points. And then the 3rd receiver was Antonio Brown with the Steelers, getting 90 yards and 2 touchdowns for a total of 21 fantasy points there on Sunday night against the Panthers of all teams. So that's your top 3 receivers for week 3 for fantasy points. Then at tight end in week 3, the top tight end was Greg Olsen, the one guy we picked, the one top guy we got right. And he had 69 receiving yards and 1 touchdown for Carolina against Pittsburgh in that Sunday night game, and that gave him 12 fantasy points. The other top tight ends was there was a 4-way tie for second, and that was Dwayne Allen of the Colts, Colby Fleener of the Colts, Rob Gronkowski of the Patriots, and Andrew Corliss of the Packers. They all had 10 fantasy points. They each had a touchdown. They all had about 40 yards. Allen had 49. And then the others 43, 44, 43, respectively, between Fleener, Gronkowski, and Corliss. So those are your tight ends. And the best kicker in week 3 was Vinatieri, who had 3 for field goals. He was 3 for 3 and 5 for 5 for extra points. So he had 16 fantasy points. He's the oldest player in the NFL to not miss a kick this season. And he also, against the Jaguars, the Colts put up all those points, and that's why he had those 5 extra points and those 3 field goals to total 16 fantasy points. And then on defense, the top defense for week 3 for fantasy points was the Atlanta Falcons on that Thursday night game against Tampa. They only let up 14 points. They had 1 interception, 4 fumbles recovered. They scored 2 defensive touchdowns, and they had 3 sacks. and that totaled 28 points. So it's a big, huge fantasy week for anybody who had the Atlanta Falcons defense there going against the Bucs. So that's your fantasy leaders from the weekly rewind and fantasy points. Now let's actually look at the top stats leaders, just straight up stats, no fantasy in this part, and we're going to bring you the top 5 passing leaders, rushing leaders, and receiving leaders from week 3. So starting off, the number 1 passer in week 3 for yards was Kirk Cousins with 427 yards. He also had 3 touchdowns and an interception. Number 2 passer was Andrew Luck with 370 yards and 4 touchdowns, no interception. He was sacked 2 times though. Number 3, this is a shocker, Austin Davis of the St. Louis Rams has the game of his career with 327 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Number 4, we got Nick Foles from the Philadelphia Eagles. He had 325 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. He had quite the performance there against the Redskins. And rounding out the top 5 passers for week 3 is Geno Smith of the New York Jets, as he threw for 316 yards. He had 1 touchdown and he had 2 interceptions and he was sacked 3 times. So overall his QBR was not top 5, but he was top 5 in yards. So that was top 5 passing yards for quarterbacks in week 3. So now the top 5 rushers for week 3. Starting off, we had Rashad Jennings, who had 176 yards. He also got a touchdown. That was for the Giants against the Redskins. Then we have Le'Veon Bell, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he rushed for 147 yards. Number 3 is Knile Davis, and he rushed for 132 yards, and he also had a touchdown for the Chiefs. Then number 4 for the Pittsburgh Steelers, LeGarrette Blount, as he had 118 yards. He also scored a touchdown as well. So Blount came up huge in that game, even though he's not their main rusher. And the Steelers have 2 running backs in the top 5 for week 3. And rounding out the top 5, we have Lamar Miller of the Miami Dolphins, who came in with 108 yards, and he did that only off of 15 carries. So Lamar Miller rounded out the top 5, and also just to make clear, LeGarrette Blount, he got number 4 with only 10 carries. So as impressive as Miller with just 15 carries to get in the top 5, Blount came in number 4 with just 10 carries, and he also had that touchdown as well. So there's your top 5 rushers for week 3. Now for the top 5 receivers for week 3. Coming in at number 1, we have Julio Jones of the Atlanta Falcons, and he had 161 receiving yards. He also had 2 touchdowns. Number 2 is Jeremy Maclin of the Philadelphia Eagles. He had 154 receiving yards and 1 touchdown. Number 3 is Emmanuel Sanders of the Denver Broncos, and he had 149 receiving yards. Number 4, we got Pierre Garçon of the Washington Redskins, and he had 138 receiving yards as well as a touchdown. And rounding out the top 5, it's another Redskin. This time it's Deshaun Jackson, who had 117 yards and 1 touchdown. So just like we saw with the rushing, the Steelers had 2 rushers in the top 5. The Washington Redskins have 2 receivers in the top 5 for week 3. So now let's look at the kickers. In the top 5 kickers, we had Adam Vinatieri coming in with 14 points, as he had 3 field goals and 5 extra points and did not miss 1. Then number 2 for kickers, we had Nick Folk of the Jets, as he was 4 for 4 from field goal range, and he had 1 extra point, as he was 1 for 1 to total 13 points there in his game against Chicago. Number 3 for kickers, we had Cody Parkey from the Philadelphia Eagles, and he was 3 for 3 from field goal range, and he also was 4 for 4 with the extra points, giving him a total of 13 points. He's actually tied with Nick Folk. It's actually a 3-way tie. It's now the technically 4th guy, Sean Swissum, for the Steelers against the Panthers also had 13 points and was also 3 for 3 from field goal range and 4 for 4 from the extra point range. And rounding out the top 5, we have Josh Brown from the New York Giants. In this game against the Houston Texans, he was 3 for 3 from field goal range and 3 for 3 from extra points. And that gave him a total of 12 points on the week. So those are your top 5 kickers for week 3 of the NFL season in 2014, and that rounds up our top 5 stats for the week. And that wraps it up for our weekly rewind. And up next is Upon Further Review for the Thursday night game.
Upon further review.
Alright, so let's talk about the New York Giants going into Washington to face the Redskins, and that's the Thursday night game. You can catch that September 25th at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and that's on the NFL Network. And in this game, we got the Giants coming off a big win against the Texans as they picked up their first win of the season after having lost in Week 1 on the road to Detroit and then losing at home to Arizona. They win that game at home against the Houston Texans, and that was an impressive win because the Texans have a good defense, and they were able to run. Jennings was able to run for 176 yards. Cruz finally showed up as he'd been struggling in the first 2 weeks, and Victor Cruz had 107 yards receiving. Manning didn't have the biggest of days. He only threw for 234 yards, but he did enough to get the win. So the Giants looking really good in week 3, and they're going to try to build upon that success on Thursday night in Washington. The Redskins are coming off of a tough loss to the Eagles, and that was in Philadelphia. They lost just by a field goal in a game that saw Kirk Cousins throw for 427 passing yards. They both, Pierre Garçon and Deshaun Jackson, caught for over 100 yards in that game. Morris, though, he kind of struggled. It was his lowest rushing game of the year, as he had rushed for 91 against Houston in Houston week 1. Then Morris ran for 85 against Jacksonville and Washington. And then last week the Eagles held him to just 77. So the Redskins are going to need to get more production out of Alfred Morris against the Giants. Of course, they've got a couple other backs as well. It's not all the running duties fall upon him, even though he does get the majority of their carries. They also have Roy Helu as well as Silas Red, who can both, they get a few carries here and there, and they actually have better averages per carry. Of course, part of that is due to the light load that they have as opposed to the heavy load that Alfred Morris, as he's already got 59 carries so far this season, as he averages just slightly under 20 carries per game. Of course, they are a more pass-oriented team. They pass the ball about 75% of the time. Kirk Cousins, so he's been looking really impressive as he's thrown 5 touchdowns after having come in relief of RG3 when RG3 got injured. And he's starting to really, seems to be getting the feet under him as he's really came to play last week. I mean, he had a huge game. And that's the type of game they're going to need to have against the Giants. I actually think that the Redskins can beat the Giants. It's in Washington. The Redskins have shown so far they actually do have some defense, believe it or not, as they've got an impressive sack total. They had 10 sacks in that game there when they were facing up against Jacksonville. They were just in the backfield sacking them left and right. They need to, continue to bring that kind of pressure. They got to bring that pressure against Eli. If they can get up in Eli's face, that's going to make it a long day for the Giants. Of course, they've got to shut down the running game, but I'm questioning, is Rashad Jennings going to be able to really, bounce back 4 days after running for 176 yards? Is he going to be able to put up big numbers 4 days later against Washington? That remains to be seen. I don't think so, personally. Hey, maybe he will. We'll see. But if you see in week 1, he only put up 46 yards. In week 2, he only put up 64. And then there in week 3, he more than doubled that. So, he came out really big against the Texans. So So we'll see what he can do against the Redskins in week 4 on Thursday night. Of course, they're going to also have Deshaun Jackson and Pierre Garçon put up some big numbers as well, which they did in week 3 against the Texans. If they can continue to do that, they can put up the points that they did. If they can score like that against New York, they should win. The big question mark for Washington is if they will be able to, stop the Giants from scoring. The Giants didn't necessarily look like a team that was that tough to stop scoring until they ran up 30 points on the Texans. Of course, in that game, they did get a lot of defense. It was a well-rounded team effort for the Giants, and they're going to have to bring that same kind of effort to this game if they want to beat their rivals, the Washington Redskins. This is a big game for the NFC East. You got to win these games. The Redskins, if they want to go anywhere this season, they've got to win this game against the Giants at home. You can't afford to lose home games to division rivals. So they're going to definitely, and these teams, when they get to playing, they play their best football against each other. They said the Giants, their defense, they had the 3 interceptions, against Texas, and they've got to do that same thing. They got to show up against Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins throws the ball a lot. He's at least in what we've seen so far, he seems to be a better passer than Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick doesn't get as many pass attempts, although he's a real smart quarterback. But Kirk Cousins has been picking apart defenses and racking up some big numbers. They said that was really impressive what he did against the Texans. He's got to protect the ball. He's pretty good at protecting the ball. So far, he's only thrown the 1 interception. So if he can protect the ball, it'll be all right. But the secondary of New York is very talented. Antrell Roll and Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie, they both had a pick last week, as well as Akamara. So that secondary is going to be a big factor. If they can shut down Garçon and Jackson, that'll go a long way towards the Giants being competitive in this game. Of course, they've got to protect the ball as well, because Eli is known to throw interceptions. He's already thrown 4 interceptions this year. Of course, he was able to get above his interception ratio as he now has 5 passing touchdowns. But going into last week, he actually had more interceptions than touchdowns. But we'll see, which Eli shows up in Washington. It's going to be the touchdown throwing Eli, or is it going to be the interception throwing Eli, or is it going to be some combination of the two? And on prime time, the pressure will be on. But I just think coming off the short week, I got to give the advantage to the Redskins, especially they're at home, and they also seem to just be a team that's a little bit deeper. I just think with the running backs that they have, Dale Young also, they can kind of, they don't have to rely just on Morris, even though they seem to rely heavily on him. They've got other guys to give it to, whereas the Giants a little bit more limited. Although Andre Williams has been getting some touches to split with Jennings, but Jennings by far, he has 68 touches compared to just 19 for Williams. Like I said, he ran so much, against the Texans, and that's a tough run, run against that Houston Texans defense. He's got to be banged up, and he's going to struggle to run the ball against Washington. I could be wrong. We'll see on Thursday night. But I just think that the Redskins are going to be able to run the ball better. I also think they just have the depth at receiver as well. And I think that their defense is going to cause some turnovers. They should intercept Eli, and that's going to be the difference. Will be those turnovers. If Eli can play a mistake-free game, the Giants win. But I think he does throw an interception, maybe 2 interceptions, and that will be the difference. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Very interested to hear what you have to say. Just leave it right there in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this show, and if you did enjoy it, make sure to hit the like button. Also, make sure to subscribe, as we are bringing you the Wedge each and every single week, along with many bonus upon further reviews, as we have an upon further review for every single game of the weekend, and we upload those between now and when the games start. on Sunday, as well as on Monday morning we have the Upon Further review for the Monday night game. We also bring you recaps from every game, as well as recaps from games in college football as well. So keep an eye out for those. And once again, thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a great weekend and enjoy all the football.